morning and welcome to Inspiratia's New Tech, Hydrogen and CCUS webinar. We are here to open the debate and set the scene for the sector's investment landscape ahead of our New Tech, Hydrogen and CCUS Summit, which will take place in Berlin on the 7th of November. Thank you very much and welcome to our speakers today. We have Richard Hulf, Managing Partner at Hydrogen One Capital, Antonio Bagnon, Legal Director, Squire Patton Boggs, Robert Todd, Managing Director at CIBC Capital, and Pietro Crescini, Senior Director at Bayern LB. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I'd like to start with a question on project financing activity in hydrogen, which in Europe at least remains small in compared to the number of new projects that are being announced. So what would you say are the hurdles that make the pipeline hard to invest in at the moment? Richard, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, well, I suppose the way that the projects are currently structured, we track about 80 to 100 green hydrogen projects that are on globally, about 100 megawatts. But the largest is in China, it's 150 megawatts, but the other sort of 315 megawatts that are currently on stream are all relatively small. They're all in the sort of 10 to 20 megawatt range. And I think so far they've not needed project finance. And so a lot of projects you're seeing are either self-financed as they have been in China or just from balance sheet. But we're entering into a phase now. I mean, we at Hydrogen One are taking FID on two 100 megawatt projects, one in Germany, one in Norway, and we're just putting that project finance into place. So I think it's on track. It's just it hasn't happened yet. So I think that's the reason.
Thank you. That's interesting to hear. And from the debt providers in the room here, what is your perspective?
Yes, I can start. I think it's the pipeline is very healthy, as it was mentioned before. That there's a lot of talk about projects, hydrogen projects. There are two, maybe one. The biggest for me is that there is demand, but there is no one of taking it. There is demand in terms of industry, transport, heat, and power. Because hydrogen can do many things, but in practical terms, there are no off-takers, and the market is not geared up to off-take production. And maybe that is also to do with the fact that some of the off-takers that are available may not be investment grade, and that is unheard of for banks. And maybe there are other issues around storage, around network, and supply chain.
Yeah, maybe to jump in. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invite. Really looking forward to the event next month. I think to complement, and I would echo those points. I think at the start of any new industry, and this one remains very young, that there's clearly understanding all the different fundamental elements of it, but then there's perhaps some additional complexities around the integrated nature of the technologies, even if they're bankable in their individual rights. So that's something which I think banks are and other investors are trying to become more familiar with. I think for us as well, what we found with the beginning of any new technology really is ensuring that through the firm, through the team on the structuring side, but crucially around the risk process as well, that there's familiarization about the approaches, the technologies throughout the organization, so that the organization can be more seasoned around what does a hydrogen project entail. There's clearly a lot of different diversities in projects, for different structures and different business models. So I think that will take some time. And I think for some of the early projects, the sponsorship and the credibility of the team clearly will be a big factor. And we saw that in early stages, things like the offshore wind market, etc., and battery storage as well.
Thank you, Robert. That was also a very interesting point to make. And Antonio, from a legal advisor point of view, I'm sure you have a pretty broad spectrum of clients that you advise on in this sector. What do you hear from them, and what's your view on this one?
Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Richard said, and I think that's a key point, which is the fact that it's a early stage technology, and somehow, and there are a lot of projects. It's a very healthy pipeline. So I believe that this hasn't reached the point to actually see project finance being actually launched somehow. But from a legal perspective, I believe that the main hurdle will be the fact that it's still young, and as young, it's being created. The legal framework is being created. I think that the fact that within the European Union you have the directive, which has been recently modified, and we'll talk about that later. But that implies the fact that individual countries within the state members have their own legal framework being developed. They don't have the obligation to implement the directive until 2 years from now. So there's different countries are at different stages. So therefore, also both the companies involved with promoting these projects, as well as banks, have different scenarios, different legal frameworks, which never helps. I believe that this needs to be like unified somehow, and therefore it will definitely help. It's in the correct path. There are different proposals. Every state member has a proposal. UK has a very strong legal framework, and therefore it's just a question of time because to deploy all the pipeline that currently exists.
Yeah, and Antonio, thank you very much for bringing up the EU directive and the recently approved definition of what constitutes renewable hydrogen. I would like to hear from the other panelists as well how that's been received by the industry and by them as players, and yeah, what more can be done, and will these help push the sector forward?
Let me go with that one first of all. As we understand it, it's renewable liquid and gaseous fuels of non-biological origin, and that doesn't really affect us as a fund. We're more interested in green hydrogen, and we're pushing ahead with projects of that nature. We could invest into the other areas, but green hydrogen seems to be the form that's captured the imagination, and that's about accessing electrolyzers, grid connections, and having the right kind of sites. And I think there's a bit of a land rush going on at the moment to capture all those elements first of all. But no, so far the definitions they lay well with us as an investment fund.
Yeah, so Robert, would you like to?
Yeah, from my standpoint, this is a crucial step in the process, and it provides clarity. And then, of course, now we're already working on RED 3, which will be an expansion of the scope and so forth. And what it means in practice, and we found this with live assignments where we are helping developers find partners, is, what is the right perimeter for a project? And does that include, and we're working on hydrogen, ammonia, and e-methanol, do you include the renewables within the perimeter for the new investor? Do you exclude it? Do you bring in other partners? But what's clear is you need significant incremental renewables today, and that is a challenge in order to produce the volume of fuels that are targeted going forward.
Yes, and if I can add that, I guess if we are all on a journey to net zero, clearly that helps us to go through the journey, as in, we need more renewable projects to support the green hydrogen sort of revolution, and just not to fall into maybe the easy parts of different shades of color of hydrogen, which might be easier to sort out, whether it's through the oil industry or else, and I think it's the right way forward, so that we can all focus on green hydrogen, and we can all focus on our journey to net zero.
Thanks for that. And I mean, obviously, as with all new and emerging technologies, there are some markets are more advanced than others. And how would you say the UK and European markets compare to the US, Australia, and the Middle East?
I can take that one first, if you like. I suppose the first comparisons between the US and Europe. There's nothing like simplicity to get a market underway, and the US has really cracked it in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. Is the simplicity that's going to is attracting investors into the space compared to a slightly fragmented approach through RE Power and all the different countries and states in Europe. It's not quite as simple and probably won't get underway quite as quickly. But then the US has also got a very, very strong oil and gas lobby that will do everything it can to slow down the growth of green hydrogen, and they'll probably end up going for more blue hydrogen over there. And when it comes into Europe, I think European mainland is well ahead of the UK. The UK is not really taking renewable hydrogen seriously. And that's just indicated by the 20 projects they're looking at. They're talking about, 400-500 million of funding. Any individual country in Europe, you're talking about billions of euros of funding. So there's no real comparison. Although the UK in the past has been pretty good at contracts for differences that it managed to get. We managed to get the offshore wind sector going. And that could be a great help to the hydrogen sector. But I think Europe's looking at that as well. So I'll leave Middle East and Australia to the other guys.
Yes, maybe if we can start with the Middle East. Of course, the Middle East closed last year and started with a bang with NEOM, which is defined as green hydrogen deal, and that was $8 billion US dollars. So sizable, sort of a hybrid structure, but still closed in Saudi Arabia, but still it's the largest and the to date. So that means that there are banks willing to invest, because there are $6 billion of financing on that project. And I would say, arguably, therefore, according to numbers, is the leading market, although it's only one big project. And in Europe at the moment, I completely agree that there's only a handful of projects that are close to final investment decision, but banks are still getting involved, and maybe we start seeing closing early in the next year. But it is a long way to go, but hopefully it's going to be a market as big as the current renewables market.
Robert, would you agree with that?
I would. I think it's been fascinating, really. It's been a bit of a foot race, and you had early starters like the UK and so forth, but other regions of the world have really accelerated around this path. And I think what I've been interesting for me is even in Europe, there's over 50 policies now related to development in some shape or form. And they've also targeted themselves to become the first climate neutral continent in the world. And as part of that, it's almost fostered a whole advisory industry to navigate through the policies, if you're in the developer's shoes, to try to access different pockets of funding, not fall into a trap of double dipping and so forth. But notwithstanding, there's some very robust steps to press ahead, and both from a domestic perspective and, of course, importing green fuels into the European Union. Elsewhere, the likes of ourselves are clearly very active in Canada, across from the US, and also some ambitious progress around their own ITC program and so forth. And so whether it's East Coast, West Coast, there are also some interesting developments there, which will have an impact both in Asia and Europe as well. So that's another area where there'll be tremendous growth looking ahead.
Thank you. And Antonio, again, from a legal advisor perspective, with probably advices on different countries, different regions, what do you see?
Well, actually, I think that one player that was mentioned was Australia. Actually, our colleagues in Australia, our offices there are very active with hydrogen projects. It seems to be that Australia is also one of the front runners with this. They have a lot of projects in the pipeline. They have already done some transportation, exportation with hydrogen. I believe to Japan was in February, I think it was last year, and they've actually gotten a lot of advanced technologies and working with a lot with electrolyzers, especially, which is kind of basically one of the main backbone of renewables, renewable hydrogen. So I think that, yeah, Australia, along with Europe, which it seems to be the two main jurisdictions right now where there are a lot of action. From a legal perspective, definitely the European Union is moving forward. And from an EU perspective, obviously state members, as I mentioned before, are at different pace, but clearly that's everyone's looking forward to clear the legal framework for hydrogen.
Thank you. There was a good geographical overview of where different markets stand at the moment, and we've touched a little bit on policy and regulation, but I think it's probably like a very important point to cover for again a new and emerging technology and sector like hydrogen. So what is the role of government and regulation in creating a market for hydrogen? I mean, is there anything missing? Is there anything that some governments have done particularly well compared to others? And also what's the expectations? What are you looking at the moment?
I don't know if you want. Oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say quickly, with governments, given the tightness of capital at the moment in all markets, and particularly with governments, I don't think we can really look towards governments in the short term to start breaking out large amounts of capital to get projects going. But what governments could do, just being realistic about it, is to start being more active on regulation. If in the EU or even just in the UK, somebody said, right, grey hydrogen from 2030 is banned, then people would have to move towards renewable hydrogen. At the moment, and there's no real guidance on that. So I think the best role that governments can play globally is on setting the boundaries of the rules about what's acceptable to society, and it will find a way of funding itself. Contracts for differences are a great way of governments being there as the kind of buyer of last resort on pricing to help get things underway, kind of speeds things up a bit. But there's nothing like a bit of stick and carrot to get the sector going in terms of you just can't do grey hydrogen beyond this certain time. And that would be really helpful, I think.
I would certainly echo that, Richard. From my sort of discussions with clients, on the developer side, they ask me, where is the demand? And I think that would go to a large extent to help catalyze that initial demand. And on the other side, the buyers are saying, why should I spend? Because there is an associated green premium to a lot of the alternatives to the fossil-based fuels. And these are quite frequent questions that we get. So I would echo policy surrounding those elements to really help catalyze the market. But I think it needs to be firstly holistic. So it needs to take into account broader infrastructure, not just the generation itself. And that's a challenge we see around areas like pipelines or receiving terminals and so forth. But also, I think it should be done progressively rather than necessarily these multi-gigawatt programs only, which create headlines, but create challenges in deliverability because there isn't the supply chain today to fulfill those. And what we see is small steps could help prove out the business model, prove out the economics as that demand grows. And that's an approach I think that works well, particularly in the EU, whereas other jurisdictions are going for mega-sized facilities. And some of those create further delays, I suppose. So if government can play a role in that to encourage those types of installations and grow the installed capacity, a bit like when renewables first began at the small scale and so forth, I think that could be helpful.
Yes, and if I can add as well, clearly the government can help to clear all those hurdles that we mentioned before. And to me, the biggest hurdle is about demand. So how can they incentivize demand, and how can they support the creation of demand, which is there, but there are it's difficult to be found as a route to market, which is quite not very obvious, but I think that's what the reality is.
Antonio, what's your view on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing is that to understand that hydrogen has a lot of sections around it that need to be regulated different ways. So you have the creation of the management, you have developing on industrial supply chains for electrolyzers, you have exports, imports, you have the regulation around hydrogen as a fuel. Production of hydrogen, the plants, how to generate the energy renewables to make the electrolyzers work. So definitely it's a huge huge concept touching different parts of regulation. Definitely governments are adopting, at least, for instance, the jurisdiction I know the best obviously is Spain, and they have been doing small steps, trying to adapt, for instance, environmental regulations and trying to accelerate the permitting of the granting of permits for the generation of renewables, and that's definitely the steps to go. It's not an easy thing to do because, as I mentioned, it's different areas with different particularities, touching different nations with different interests. So definitely, it's. I mean, you can see just an overview of in Europe the different consideration around renewables that you can see from Poland, Germany, France, Spain. So that's not easy to get together. And definitely the fact that in Europe we're reaching an agreement, as with the definitions you mentioned before, with a new amendment to the Renewable Energy Directive, pushing those permitting limits. As Richard said, obviously drastic measures would push definitely to the new blue or green hydrogen situation, prohibiting the action of gray hydrogen. But I think that that's going to be a bit tough to get, although it would be the most efficient way to reach this regulatory push to hydrogen. But definitely they're adopting, there being different measures being adopted, and what's missing is I believe that what's missing is a unified regulation in every level in Europe, for instance. Because you already have the society is already accepting hydrogen as a vector to reach net zero, and it's a need. So definitely that's something positive in order to reach that needed legal framework.
Thank you. This was, I feel like, a pretty exhaustive overview of where we stand with policy and regulation. Moving on a little bit more onto the financing side of things. What does the learning curve looks like for funds, financiers and developers? What sorts of financial instruments need to be deployed to guarantee these emerging asset classes success? Richard, would you like to take the lead on that one, maybe from a fund's perspective?
From a sort of fundamentals perspective, I'm an engineer originally by background, and what you're looking at with hydrogen is a classic mixture of electrons and molecules, and that really throws everybody, because you either come from the utility sector where you're with the electrons, or you're in the oil and gas sector where you're with molecules, and hydrogen's a mixture of the two. So there's quite a lot of background reading that needs to be done by everybody, sort of back to school physics class, just to get yourself up to speed on megawatt hours, dollars, euros per kilo, compared to dollars per barrel, and all the other measures that people are used to. But once you've crossed that boundary, it's pretty straightforward. Particularly in green hydrogen, it's just splitting water. So it's cost of access to water, access to electricity, and as Pietro said earlier, the big barrier to getting this thing started is getting offtake, and so that's all coming up. So there's a barrier on fundamentals, but once you've crossed it, it's back to DCF modeling, cash flows, project financing. It's just the same as everything we've been doing. I don't think the learning curve should be particularly steep. It's just crossing that boundary of coming out of both those sectors into this new one.
Thank you. And what do the lenders in the room think about this one?
I actually agree with what Richard said, and despite not being an engineer and despite asking my son to remind me how does electrolysis work, which now I understand, it's very much the same, and the hurdles are the same. So where does the electricity come from? Where does and how is that contracted? Where does the water comes from, and how is that contracted? And assuming that the technology is well known and understood and has been going on for many years, and done at school even, what do we do with the final product, and whether the final product, and what is the usage of that final product, and if that is sustainable. And then I go back maybe to my first point, where where is the demand and who actually buys it, and can they afford it for a bank to buy it for 10 or 15 years, and then it goes back to the creditworthiness of the off-taker.
I think maybe to supplement from an advisory perspective, I sort of see two camps of investors really. There are those in discovery, and there are those who are ready to deploy, and the bulk of them remain in the first camp. Having said that, there's a much broader universe of prospective partners that we tend to find get engaged, either from an oil and gas background, so they bring the molecule side of the story, from a renewables background, and more broadly. So if you think about how to bring together complementary partners to bring projects to life, it could be quite varied. And you've seen a really diverse range of partnerships coming together over the last couple of years. And within the different categories, beyond some of the strategics and other financials, you've got the emergence of specialists who are really trying to tailor their investment criteria to come into transition segments like these. And as part of all of this, the question then remains: what is a reasonable return for the projects that come to fruition, and what are investors willing to or seeking to secure? And so I think that's still very much an emerging area. But partnership is core throughout it, and so beyond the capital, through the DevEx cycle, through CapEx, and through senior debt and so forth, it's really, what other synergies can those partners bring to support the project, to bring it to life? And I think there's a realization that no single group has all the necessary skills to do that throughout the life cycle. So that's quite fascinating for me to uncover, who and what makes a good partnership for these projects.
Antonio, what's your view on this one? And maybe if you can tell us the type of clients that you have been advising on hydrogen projects, and the one that you see as being the most active at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be the approach. Obviously, I'm more of a law guy, so obviously the financing part and the numbers are not my best friends. But yeah, clients have been very interesting, and the learning curve, Richard already anticipated. It's not like as steep as you might think. It's just going back to basics, and they already kind of understand what's behind all the hydrogen mechanism, so that makes it easier for them to just jump in. And here, I mean, we have projects that have been already. We have a hydrogen facility in Madrid that has been already been operating for a year, I believe, and it's basically for supply of hydrogen to municipal buses for transportation. And I mean, this is working, and it has received the support from all the authorities in Spain, and obviously has been receiving financing. So that's an example that it works and it's happening. So I mean that's a success for the sector, and in Spain we're very happy to have that. And in Squire, obviously we are very excited to have been involved with it, and it's a clear example of what it has to happen, and it's gonna happen. This is a small scale obviously project, but it's just a matter of having more of this and just finalizing the implementation of all the projects that are in the pipeline.
Can I just add another couple of points? Having done exactly this kind of project financing in the oil and gas sector, there would be the initial lead bank, and then there would be the loan will be syndicated out on a project. and we'd be talking about proven, probable, possible oil cases. E.g., how much cash is going to flow out of this oil field over the next kind of 20 or 30 years. And you wouldn't believe how risky that really is in real life. Yet people were quite prepared to just to accept the risk and then loan to 2/3 of the cash flow, into the future. Hydrogen projects are very much less risky than that. You're basically getting access to water. The biggest risk is that is offtake. As soon as the offtake's in place, you're talking about assembling electrolyzers on land, onshore, connecting them up to green electricity and water, and that's it. So, but I think initially it's going to take longer than people think. So we're going to need some patient capital. We're going to need much more well thought out syndication to de-risk. After the lead banks come in, we're going to need sort of revolving credit to allow the company that's proposing the projects to carry on running itself to the point where the project finance comes in place. So it's already there, but I think we're just going to have a bit more patient and give the sector a bit of breathing space. But ultimately, the risks technically are much less than the banking sector has been used to. They've got its head around, in the oil and gas sector.
Thank you. It's thank you. It's been a very thorough and in-depth discussion so far. I am conscious of time, but I think we have time for a more couple of questions. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about other new technologies in relation to hydrogen, and obviously one of them is CCUS. Is carbon capture and storage a necessity for decarbonizing hydrogen in the short term? And does market perspective differ between the UK and the rest of Europe on that one?
Let me have a go. We don't have much experience of carbon capture. We know that people will probably not looked into it much themselves, but there's a lot of it in the US. There's a lot of carbon capture that's been going on over the last 20 years. So if ever we were going to invest into carbon capture, it'd probably be in the US. It needs cavern storage. It needs depleted oil and gas fields. The whole thing is really a lot more risky and hard to bolt together than basically splitting water, making hydrogen from water, green hydrogen. So I think it could be more complex, but I suppose the financial sector might see more similarity with the oil and gas sector, things they've already done. But no, we haven't had much experience of this, and we're not really planning. We can do these sorts of things, but we're preferring green hydrogen, really.
Yeah, and if I can add that, I think that's very clear, because I think carbon capture is looked by very large companies in, as you mentioned, maybe in some brownfields, and that is their way maybe to enter the space and bring their big shoulders in terms of technology and in terms of experience and in terms of access to capital and so on. But I would agree that green hydrogen is probably the best route to the net zero. And I'm not an engineer again, but I agree that the technology to me seems very simple.
A couple of things I would certainly raise is I think being proven at scale is clearly a frontier that needs to be overcome for the technology. It will play a crucial role in some value chains. We're working, for example, on an e-methanol project at the moment, and you need a source of CO2, and there are regulations around the period of which you're allowed non-biogenic versus biogenic and so forth. So there's clearly a role there for CCUS to play. The other thing is we have a lot of Japanese clients. In my trip to Japan last week, there's a big focus around ENG, e-methane, how you like to call it. And there are propositions out there to produce those products. But there clearly needs to be a CCUS component to that story. And you need to have a whole sort of set of reverse logistics, if you like, in order to close the value chain to deliver carbon-free power and so forth in that space. So I think there is a lot of focus on it. Certainly proving it out at scale is critical, but it can play a key role in some of the products that we're looking to deliver into the market looking ahead.
Thank you. And Antonio, have you looked at carbon capture at all?
I mean, we have a lot of active projects in Australia. There's a lot of action also in some action also in the UK. Although Europe, from a regulatory perspective, I mean, it is clear that it's part of the strategy. The CCUS is part of the decarbonization strategy, but it's not clear that it's been implemented from a legal perspective. It's part of the strategy, is there, but it's not clear what's around it, how to implement it, and therefore that makes it a bit more complicated to see defined projects or defined actions around CCUS in for instance, in Spain or France. However, yeah, in Australia and in the UK, there are a lot of actions around it. It's definitely, I believe that it's a bridge technology. I mean, Robert was already mentioned it before. It's somehow a bridge technology until hydrogen, which is what Pietro said, that the fact that hydrogen is actually the best route. But until that is actually fully implemented, some technologies such as CCUS can work as a kind of bridge technology for it.
Thank you. So we've touched on policy and regulation. We've touched on existing financing mechanisms and the opportunities. I'd like to wrap up with a bit of a general question and kind of like a bit looking ahead type of question. So what would you say are the main opportunities and challenges within the hydrogen asset class? I mean, it sounds like green hydrogen is a little bit the emerging the emerging aspect of the asset class, but yeah, if you were to kind of like list a couple of those looking ahead at the next 12 to 18 months, what would you say?
Let me start, just to kick it off. One of the main opportunities in the UK, which has got quite a lot of political backing, but political opponents as well, is grid blending of hydrogen. The UK in particular was ready for hydrogen quite a long time ago. When we used to burn town gas before we had North Sea gas, we had these great containers in the towns that would store the town gas by burning coal, and that was 20% hydrogen even back then. But hydrogen is a very sneaky gas that will find its way through most pipes. So, but we've converted all our pipes in the UK to these yellow plastic pipes. It's only the interconnections between the different zones that make it tricky. But we're pretty much ready for 20% hydrogen in the UK, and so that is a huge opportunity. That would really give answer the demand question very quickly. And I know a lot of companies like Centrica, Octopus, and others are sort of making preparations for that kind of thing. I think Germany's also looking at the same. So that will be one good one, I think, just to get things started.
Well, from my side, I'm very optimistic. And it really comes down to the pace of change, I suppose. We've moved quite quickly from, what is the hydrogen rainbow through to a huge amount of new policy formation. And now we're really focusing on contracting, demand, supply chain, and so forth. And then that's where a lot of the policy is getting directed. Remember, today it's a 90 million ton market already, hydrogen, but grey, for likes of refineries, chemical groups, and so forth. And they're the ones as part of the decarbonisation. So amongst a choppy market, you've seen public renewables down 20+%, even more. There's still huge investments around hydrogen, north of 350% from different sources that we've seen. So it is popular amongst investors. RED 2's here, RED 3's coming. We're seeing all the new rules around correlation and so forth, renewable supply. So that gives us real cause for optimism. And the bits that we're now focused on are really about the specific applications and finding projects that have a reason to win, backed by credible teams. And we see those immediate applications in methanol for maritime fuel, as Richard mentions, in the gas blending side, particularly in the likes of Germany, Heavy trucking is another one I would add to that list, where there's a concerted effort around refueling and so forth in that area. So I think lots of cause for optimism. Some of the challenges which are associated have been well documented. Really, it's the holistic nature, the broader infrastructure, how to upscale the whole value chain in a coordinated manner, I suppose. The cost profile and particularly the supply chain, I would mention, and those are areas which will mean that it needs to be done in a sort of progressive basis over time.
Thank you, Pietro. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's I always think that the hydrogen is clearly the most bountiful element found in the universe, and can provide arguably everlasting and pollution-free source of power. And if you compare it with the oil industry, fossil fuel is extracted in hostile environments. It divides countries between those who are rich in oil and those who are not. Can lead to tensions from war to football nowadays as well, and not to mention that it clearly has an impact on climate change. So hydrogen does look somehow too good to be true, but it's also true that once you produce all this hydrogen, what do you do with it? Where is the demand? How do you store it? How do you transport it? And that's the main challenge. But we are on the right path.
And just to conclude, I mean, from taking it to obviously my legal area is basically, I believe that the biggest challenge is somehow the lack of clear and harmonized standards throughout. I mean, obviously from a technical perspective, companies working around hydrogen know what they want, know what is needed. The problem is the framework, there's a lack of clear and harmonized standards there. Good thing is that as an opportunity to fight that challenge is the fact that all governments seem to be on board, acknowledging that hydrogen is a need for that net zero objective that they have set. And therefore, if the government who are in fact the authorities are actually setting those rules and those standards are on board, it's definitely just a matter of time for them to reach an agreement to get that legal framework clear.
Thank you everyone for an interesting and positive conversation on this new emerging technology that is hydrogen and partly CCUS. Thank you very much again to Richard Half of Hydrogen One Capital, Antonio Bagnon, Squire Patton-Boggs, Robert Todd of CIBC Capital, Pietro Crescini of BioNLB. We look forward to seeing you all in Berlin on the 7th of November for Inspiratia's New Tech, Hydrogen and CCUS Summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.